I remember the days when Western AAA gaming is actually good, but I feel like we're not gonna get better as we're witnessing more anti-consumer practices growing on an industry who relies way too much on sustaining games rather than making them. I want to talk about this topic to highlight to you guys a decline on the Western gaming industry and how it can potentially crash. But before we get to it, this video is brought to you by my wonderful sponsors, you guys who donated to me through many means. Check them out, links down below. Also, huge thanks to Bottle of Water, Autumn Coffee, and I can't pronounce that, but since the previous two patrons are drinks, I'll say a pint of vodka. You guys are fantastic. It's no secret that I love the Japanese game industry. I talk so much about how I love the Japanese gaming industry these days, and that's because they have been producing really good games lately. Games that still stay with the traditional single-player business model. But in truth, I'm starting to love and appreciate them more only from the past 2 years when Resident Evil 7, Persona 5, Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and Nier Automata were released. 2017 was the year where the Western AAA games are starting to lose my interest. Wolfenstein 2 and Mass Effect Andromeda disappointed me the most that year. I lost interest with the new Assassin's Creed game at that time. Destiny 2 is not that great, and Star Wars Battlefront 2 is really not that great. What did gain my interest was the aforementioned Japanese AAA games, the AA market, and the indie titles. Pyre, Hollow Knight, Cuphead, Divinity Original Sin 2, A Hat in Time, Hellblade, and many more. Then comes 2018, the year where console exclusives truly dominate the market, and most of them are from Sony. God of War and Spider-Man are critically acclaimed games that people love, and while I don't think those two games are as amazing as people say, they're still very solid single-player games that still maintain the traditional single-player model. Then there's Detroit, which wasn't amazing, but I still enjoyed it. And of course, the biggest game of that year, Red Dead Redemption 2, a console exclusive game so utterly big, I still haven't even finished it to this day, and so are many other players. But aside from the console exclusives, we have Far Cry 5, which was fine, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which was not fine, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which was bleh, Just Cause 4, which is an utter disappointment, and Fallout 76, which is, well, Fallout 76. And once again, it was the Japanese AAA market that brings us Monster Hunter World, Octopath Traveler, Smash Bros. Ultimate, and the indie market that brings us Return of the Obra Dinn and Dead Cells and Celeste that won the year for me. I bring these 2 years up to highlight to you guys one point. I'm starting to not love the Western AAA games as much as I did back then. I mean, seriously, back then we see BioWare releasing games like the original Mass Effect and Dragon Age, and now BioWare is stuck with controversies after controversies regarding Anthem and many of their previous games. There was a time where I can get legitimately excited over a Bethesda game, and that's not gonna happen at all in current year. And there was also a time where Valve actually makes video games. Don't you guys miss those days? But those days are gone, and that's thanks to the Western AAA gaming industry not providing me anything worthy of excitement. The last time it did, it was last year through the aforementioned console exclusives, but as good as the console exclusives were, they aren't representative of the whole story of the last year's Western AAA market. Other than those, the Western AAA games range from fine to utter trash, and all of those problems are made worse with the many anti-consumer practices that we see in the past couple of years. Microtransactions, loot boxes, greedy publishers, overworked and underpaid workers, and rushed video games are problems that we're seeing more and more in the West, to the point where the government had to step in. AAA Western gaming companies are on a decline because a lot of the major game companies these days care more about monetizing their games than actually making good and exciting product for the consumer. They care more about having a game that they can support for years rather than actually making new games. Unfortunately, there's a lot of work being put in sustaining games for long, as we see in Epic's example through Fortnite, BioWare through Anthem, and Activision Blizzard through COD Blobs 4. We see that game developers have to suffer a lot in sustaining the popularity of those games. If this continues even further, if this stream of anti-consumer business practices and hellish work environment continue throughout the years, I don't think the Western AAA gaming industry can sustain themselves. But the funniest thing about all of this is that we're living in a time where making video games these days are getting cheaper, easier, and better than ever. There was a Kotaku article talking about what I'm basically talking about in general throughout this video that raises a point that video games are getting more costly in more ways than one. It's really not, or at least I don't believe it is. Hellblade was made in a very tight budget, and the game not only looks spectacular, it is an amazing game that sold very well. Ninja Theory is able to break even at 500,000 sales that they got in just 4 months, and they're able to sell 1 million copies last year. Game engines are getting cheaper, even free sometimes for personal use, and they can produce better games for all platforms. Tutorials out there are available for you on the internet to learn how to code and program and design video games. Anyone can be a game developer if they're willing to work hard and learn. Hell, I learned a lot of things on the internet. Video editing, photo editing, PC building, even PC and laptop repairs from the internet. All of these things can be very beneficial for me and a lot of people in the future, and you can learn more for free if you're willing to work hard and put some effort into it. Do you know why video games cost more these days? The answer is very simple, and we don't need to look hard for it. A lot of these stories of game developers facing crunch time and hellish work environments really do shine a big picture in the state of the industry. Having more developers working extra time could lead to more cost. Having staffs being laid off could lead to more money spent on hiring new staffs and restructuring in general. Rushing your developers to develop games in a very tight and constrained time period. Scrapping ideas and concepts that waste people's time and money. Video game executives these days are getting ridiculously overpaid. Way too much money being spent on marketing the game. And you wonder why video games cost more? Proper management is something that is lost within the confines of AAA game companies these days. And if game companies continue to do this, then they're gonna suffer the same fate that Telltale Games suffered from. They too also suffer from incredibly poor management, too many video games being launched with too little innovation in between, and of course the developers being put on crunch. All of that costs money, and they're making single-player games. It's evident from many news articles and exposés that sustainable multiplayer games, or the so-called games as a service model, is being done at a great cost. Amongst the big Western AAA game publishers, traditional single-player games are not as prevalent as before, and that sentiment is only getting more and more true as time went on. I find it interesting that a big publisher like Bethesda, who still publishes single-player games, are not promoting their 2 big releases this year as much. Rage 2 is popcorn entertainment that isn't really worth that $60 price tag, and their release was about as impactful as a popcorn being thrown to the head. Wolfenstein Youngblood is coming in a couple of days. Do you guys know that? But going back to the Kotaku article I mentioned, the writer is correct. The video game industry just can't go on like this, specifically the Western AAA gaming industry. This practice is evidently not sustainable. More money is being pointlessly wasted, more people being laid off and overworked and underpaid, more people are being overpaid, and all of this results in subpar products riddled with microtransactions and loot boxes and many other anti-consumer business practices. Products that you have to manage for years to come, because single-player games are dead, right? They're not as profitable these days, right? And you wonder why I prefer Japanese games these days. So who to blame for this entire situation? Who has brought the Western gaming industry to this point? I suppose there are a couple of factors in why this happened. First off, the rise of mobile games really contribute into this phenomenon a lot. The free-to-play but pay-to-win business model has been around for years now, but it's only when the mobile games come into the gaming market that the cancer begins to spread and affecting a lot of Western AAA games these days. And it's all because mobile games are ridiculously profitable, and the Western AAA games really want to rack in on that additional profit. I suppose the blame can also go to the consumers who are buying these products. I mean, FIFA keeps on racking tons and tons of money to the point where parents actually complain that their kids are using their credit cards without their knowledge. Buying these products is essentially a message to the publishers that this sort of business model is okay, and unfortunately, as long as these uninformed and unaware consumers exist, there won't be a change to the way the market works. I mean, the Lion King remake performed very well. That's practically a message to Disney, hey, We want more of this stuff. But I think most of the blame should fall into the publishers. Look, microtransactions and loot boxes are generally fine if they don't interrupt the gameplay and if they are not a necessity to complete the game. But do you seriously trust these big game companies to develop a micropayment system that doesn't interrupt the whole game? Yes, the consumers are also bad for buying these micropayment items, but that's more to being uninformed or being attracted to shiny objects. Who encouraged them to buy these things? Who tells them that it's great for them to buy? Who are the ones that build themselves into relying on these monetization practices? I don't know, guys, but I'm pretty sure that they're the ones making tons and tons of money from it. The saddest part of this entire thing is that I don't think we as consumers have a lot of power in fixing these issues. These are major internal crises happening within the game company that the best way for us to discourage them is to simply not buy their games and not support their horrendous business practices. But as long as there are people who buy their products, I don't think it's gonna change anytime soon, which is why it's important to spread the news and tell everyone about the bad things that should be avoided. A lot of these things can only be solved from the inside, and unfortunately these big game companies have done so much blunders that it's gonna take a long time before they realize that this is not good for them, and at that moment, why should we wait? There are many other game developers and publishers out there who actually publishes good games. If you're tired of the Western gaming industry or the Western entertainment in general, focusing too much on remakes and reboots and sequels, then don't buy their products. Alternatives are available. And you don't have to stick with the new products. We have so many old products out there that are still good, that people can enjoy just fine in current year. You don't always have to stick with the new when the old is still accessible and still enjoyable. Not as pretty, but still good. And isn't that a bleak suggestion? We're expecting things on the future to be better, and yet these game publishers and developers are devolving so much that their older stuffs are better. There are definitely good games out there that are brand new in current year, but they're not always the norm. Support those who deserve it and don't support those who don't. As for you AAA game publishers, please sort yourself out. If the consumers can't change you, then the government will. And you don't want that to happen, do you?